Mary, for inviting me here. The Center for Cross-Faculty Inquiry seems like a unique interdisciplinary configuration, and I'm really grateful that people here were interested in my own interdisciplinary work, coming from a rather different disciplinary starting point in literary studies. I guess I should say that I'm going to be using PowerPoint to put up on the screen some of the longer quotations that I cite. I usually hate PowerPoint and don't use it. I once got a student evaluation that said his communication skills are limited to talking. And I thought, what was I supposed to be using? Telepathy or interpretive dance? But it was PowerPoint, obviously. I didn't use enough PowerPoint. So I am going to use a little bit PowerPoint today. And this passage from Michael Warner and Lauren Berlant's essay, Sex in Public, would be one of my epigraphs if I was going to read an epigraph, which I'm not. But I will put it up on the board. So you can read it if you get tired of listening to me. My title, Innocent by Contamination, is a rather cryptic phrase from African-American science fiction writer Samuel R. Delany. Delany's 1984 novel, Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand. The work of Delany's, which most directly attempts to synthesize two sides of his textual corpus, his science fiction, going back to the 1960s, and his often very graphic gay male writing about public sex, such as Hog or The Madman, or his nonfiction work, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. In our current theoretical climate, Delany's project in this novel can be read as moving the traditional science fictional interest in world building and literal travel between worlds in the direction of Warner and Berlant's queer world making, with its emphasis on intersectionality or contact between incommensurable identities, and its distinction between world or public and community or identity. This is a passage from Delany's Stars in My Pocket, which reflects explicitly on what it means to have a world, to move between worlds. And you'll note the theme there of fragmentation of identity by the end of the passage. This would be my other epigraph if I was going to read it. The phrase innocent by contamination, however, is also cited here to suggest how Delany's novel evokes and rewrites Stuart Hall's famous argument that increased attention to the politics of representation and the constitutive mediations of identity formations means the end of the innocent notion of the essential black subject. And I'm quoting there from Hall's essays, New Ethnicities, but also What is This Black in Black Popular Culture? Before I launch into a reading of Delany's novel, however, I want to backtrack for a moment and situate this analysis in the context of my current work and the way it emerges out of my most recent book, The Souls of Cyberfolk, which Mary described. Souls of Cyberfolk uses Stuart Hall and Lawrence Grossberg's articulation theory as a model for analyzing cyberpunk science fiction's development into a more general cultural formation and epistemological framework applicable across a variety of representational media and social practices. A model in which popular narratives can be read as forms of vernacular theorizing and intellectual work. The result of this generalization of cyberpunk beyond its origins in print science fiction is a popular discourse on posthumanism, which emphasizes cyberpunk's exploration of intimacy with machines and the interrogation of human nature or interiority, soul, that emerges from that intimacy. I'm especially interested in the ways in which these popular narratives elaborate the social logic of posthumanism, what David Thomas calls technicity, specifically the consequences of redefining denaturalization, not as a critical gesture of ideological demystification, but as a norm of postmodern regimes of power. And Stuart Hall, of course, defines ideology as the eternalization and naturalization of the status quo. And denaturalization then is the key move of ideology critique. This argument about how denaturalization becomes a kind of dominant logic, social logic, can be traced back to Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto and the section on the informatics of domination, an underread section of that very often read essay. In these kinds of postmodern regimes of power, Normative power is detached from naturalization or biologization as legitimation strategies, just as Lisa Nakamura in Cybertypes suggests in her analysis of online practices of identity tourism or masquerade, in which there is no body present to naturalize the personae being constructed. In such contexts, new forms of sexual and gender play often seem to proliferate, but racial and ethnic representations have tended to become even more narrow and stereotypical, rendering alternative or contestatory performances of racial difference illegible, even as the artifice of these stereotypes is laid bare and made explicit. This analysis suggests how important it is to pay increased attention to the overlap between race and technology, as well as the incommensurability of these two things. Souls of Cyberfolk opens a critique of what I call in the book the antinomies of posthuman thought, playing on the title of Marxist theorist Georg Lukács's essay on the antinomies or limits of bourgeois thought, the failure of the bourgeoisie to think dialectically, and to lapse into certain kinds of rigid dualisms. Hales defines posthumanism, Catherine Hale, my critique builds on Catherine Hales's work in How We Became Posthuman. Hales defines posthumanism as a condition of virtuality, initially specified as the assumption that material objects are interpenetrated by information patterns. So we have material objects versus information patterns. But Hales then immediately narrows down the possibilities of this formulation to argue not that the conceptual boundary between information and materiality blurs or collapses or changes in any way. Instead, she argues that materiality and information are organized into a dualism and a hierarchy, within which information is presumed to be, in some sense, more essential, more important, and more fundamental than materiality. That latter thesis, of course, is central to Hales's general critique of the technocultural tendency to privilege disembodiment, to treat cyberspace as a site of pure mind and a means of escape from bodies devalued as meat, a term and an interpretation that derives from William Gibson's paradigmatic cyberpunk novel Neuromancer. In other words, while information and materiality initially seem to be imbricated in one another for Hales, in fact, they remain distinct and separate. Their relationship turns out to be an antinomy, a dualistic relation that might be inverted, but whose structure of opposition is never displaced to permit more genuine interaction or dialogue. However, I want to return to Hales's initial formulation, which leaves open the possibility that information and matter might be more productively articulated. In fact, I would argue, the tendency to privilege disembodied information needs to be understood as one reductive response to the crisis generated by the categorical collapse of information and matter, technologies and bodies, mediation and nature. And it would be a mistake to understand this tendency to privilege information over embodiment as a necessary or inevitable consequence of the postmodern condition of virtuality. I'm interested now in problematizing a specific version of this dominant condition of virtuality as disembodied, specifically narratives in which an idea of technicity, technologically driven modes of social differentiation and belonging, replaces ethnicity. I'm looking at how science fiction writers of color intervene in this dominant narrative to point us toward a more interesting interaction or set of interactions between technicity and ethnicity. So my current work, my current book project is about developing an archive of writing of science fiction by writers and artists of color. I could talk more about that project later if people are interested. In The War of Desire and Technology, Alastair Roseanne Stone asserts that in cyberspace, the transgendered body is the natural body, given the denaturalization and disarticulation of the expressive relation between body and social persona, sex and gender, characteristic in her view of virtual systems and the prosthetic spaces of new communications technologies, to use